All right, so what we're covering right now is the perception lecture from your text. We're used to, with visual stimuli, we're used to processing things and knowing that the things that we see are not always what is. On this image here, some of you that are able to put this image up on your screen are going to see that this image, when you're on a monitor, starts to shimmer and shine. It appears that it's moving when it really isn't. And you know that it's not really moving, despite the fact that it looks like it is. This image does something similar. And in fact, for some people, this is a little easier to see. It looks like that image is shimmering. But it really isn't. It's a stationary image, and you know that. In this image here, what we see is perhaps what most of us would call an image of violence. As you look at this, it appears that the soldier has the gun pointed down towards the man's head. It appears to be an image of violence. However, if the image is framed in a different way, what we see is perhaps an image of kindness, where the man is actually being given water and has his head leaned back, perhaps from exhaustion, and he's been given water. So depending upon the framing of the image, it can either be seen as a violent image or a kind image. Here's the actual image here. In context, it is a little more ambiguous. We're not sure if it's violent or if it's friendly. Although I was told by a Marine that this is the position that you put a gun if you are not in conflict. It's the passive position, not the armed, threatening position. So perhaps that makes it even more likely that this is an image of kindness. But the framing of the image itself colors the way that we see it. And the framing of our communication transactions also impacts the way that we view a transaction. If you have bad history with somebody in the past, you'll see it in one way. Or good history, you'll see that communication transaction in another way. The framing of the conversation affects our perception. Also in this image, some people see two dragons that are actually fighting one another. Other people see a woman. This is her eye, her lips, her nose, a little necklace. So some people see dragons, some people see a woman, some people are able to switch between the two images. Our perception visually is ambiguous. This is another image of ambiguity. Some people see that this is actually a man with his legs and his butt, and he's bending over. Other folks see that this is actually a man's face. This is his nose, his eyes, his lips, and a helmet of some sort that he's wearing. So we're used to this, that sometimes the things that we see are ambiguous, have multiple interpretations, and we want you as communicators to be aware too. The way we perceive a communication is ambiguous. There are multiple possible interpretations. In your book, the definition is shared, and you can look that up later, but the things I want to highlight right now is number one, that it says it's a cognitive process. Meaning that the way that you perceive the world and perceive communication occurs internally. You actually process that internally and mentally. And then also that it's unique. Even right now, this lecture is being received in a variety of ways. For some students, they find that this lecture is very enthralling, very gripping, and you see it that way. Other folks are bored to death already. There's multiple interpretations of this communication transaction, unique. All right. So the process of perception begins with selection. Right now, all of you know that you're wearing clothes. I would assume I have some online students, and hopefully you're wearing clothes. But you know that you're clothed because you can feel the weight of your clothes on your body. But it's not necessarily something that you process. You just kind of know it, and you're not paying close attention to it. Now that I've mentioned it, some of you are paying attention to the way that your pants feel on your legs or your shirts feel on your arms. It's selection. It's when you first actually pay attention to an image. In your book, it talks about schemas. And schemas are the way that we sort of categorize and make sense of information. So in this example here, we have a description schema where we can, for instance, we had a big pile of candy. You could actually, so I said, organize this candy. Some of you might say, okay, well, here's some Mars bar candies, here's some Hershey's candies, and you would do it by the actual maker of it. Others of you might do it by color. Well, Reese's Pieces are orange, and Skittles are kind of oranges, and Reese's Peanut Butter Cups are orange, so you put them by colors. Or you might do it by types. Well, here's candy bars, here's some chewy candies, here's some crunchy candies. There's multiple ways that we can interpret and categorize data, and we do this through our schemas. In communication, we use them For instance, we categorize scripts. So that a lot of times you might be walking through the hall and you say, hey, how you doing? Somebody else will respond with, yeah, I'm doing pretty good. And it's like an automatic pilot type of transaction where it's a categorized, oh, this is a greeting script. Or when you go to a restaurant and order a meal, you have a restaurant script. Hello, my name is Johnny. I'll be your server today. What can I get you to drink? It's a script that we operate under. Sort of mindlessly, we categorize it as, okay, here's what's supposed to happen now. If a server were to come up to you and say, hi, my name is Johnny. What would you like for dessert today? You'd probably be taken back a little bit, like, okay, you're violating the script. You're not following the way that the schema is supposed to operate. All right. The functions of schema. Well, the fact of the matter is we are inundated with data from the time we wake up in the morning until the time we go to bed. There's communication coming at us all the time. And we cannot interpret every single communication transaction as if it's independently operating from other things that we know. So we categorize things to make sense of the world and to be able to operate in the world and not violate social norms. Some of the challenges to schemas is, one, if you're operating on schemas too often, or even when you are operating on it, you're basically operating at a mindless level, an automatic pilot type of situation. In fact, I used to have a church that I went to where probably 75% of the congregation was above the age of 65. And there was one gentleman there who loved to do this. People would come into church and say, hey, how you doing? And he would say, terrible. And they'd say, oh, that's good. And just keep right on walking. And this is because they were operating mindlessly. They were operating as if the script had played out in the exact way it's supposed to. How you doing? Pretty good. Oh, okay. That's good. But when he would violate the script, they were so mindless on the script that they wouldn't even notice he'd said terrible. All right? He wasn't terrible. He was just playing a little trick. But there are some challenges, the mindlessness of communication. Also, sometimes we are very selective in the way that we see the world. The way that we color, know things from the past, colors our perceptions in the future. There's an old story of a priest, an artist, and a rancher who were standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon. And they were sharing their thoughts with one another. And the priest says, wow, when I look at the Grand Canyon, it really just makes me think of the awesomeness of God, how he could carve out such a deep and beautiful chasm. And the artist says, when they look out in the Grand Canyon, well, when I see this, I just think of all the textures and colors and just the beauty that's here, the depth, and just the richness of the Grand Canyon. And the rancher says, it'd be a terrible place to lose a calf. And what they're getting at here is their histories. Actually colors the way that they see the world. From whatever perspective you're coming from, it changes the way that you see the world. And this is a challenge. That your history, the way that you viewed somebody in the past, can alter the way that you see things now. In fact, there's been studies that have been done. There's something known as the halo effect, or the first attribution error, when you first know somebody. And on the halo effect, they did a study where a teacher says to the class, you know, I won't be able to be here on Wednesday, but I'm going to have Stephen fill in for me. And Stephen's a little bit of a tough guy, you know, just put up with it and he'll deliver his lecture, just, you know, you'll get through it. And then they'll ask the students to rate that speaker. And almost always they'll be rated fairly lowly. Now, if the teacher were to prep it like this, Stephen's coming in, I won't be here on Wednesday, he's going to deliver, he's a great guy, very, very friendly, he's going to do a great job, you'll really love him. Just by prefacing who Stephen is and what he's going to do, even if Stephen delivers the same lecture, he's perceived in a different way. More positively if there's been a positive introduction, and more negatively if there's been a negative introduction. So when you first meet somebody, if you tend to think of that person as somebody who's just a jerk, it's hard to overcome that. First impressions really do last. So that's one part of our selective perception. Also, they can create undue influence. This is one reason why we're disproportionately more likely to believe celebrities when they endorse a product than when just a common everyday person does. It's undue influence of celebrities. All right, attribution. This is how you actually interpret your perceptions. So if, for instance, somebody were to come into class one day and they were just to be like, they snap at you for some reason, but generally they're very, very nice, it would tend to be that you would explain it in a way like, well, they're just having a tough day, let's let this go. Or if the person where somebody was kind of, a little bit more tense, they come in and snap, you're going to say, oh, they're just a jerk. Those kinds of things. So the way that we attribute the explanations for things is reliant upon our perceptions, which are sometimes faulty. There is something that's known as the interaction appearance theory. And thank goodness for the interaction appearance theory. This happens to be that when you actually get to know somebody, as you get to know them, especially if you like them, they become more attractive. And the reason why I say thank goodness for this is because otherwise I would have no hope of getting married. All right, so even when I was dating my wife, she came over to my house one day to watch Say Anything with John Cusack in it. And when she was there, my best friend had come in just a few minutes into the movie, and she looked over there. He's a good-looking guy, and she thought, "Oh, who's this?" But as she got to know me, she found me more attractive. And I'm sure that some of you have experienced this before. You meet somebody, and they're just kind of common or ordinary to you, and as you get to know them, you start to find them more attractive. Perhaps you meet somebody with a disability, and at first that's all you notice. If somebody maybe with palsy, and you notice their arm, and that's a feature that you pay attention to. But as you get to know them, you start to not even think of that anymore. Interaction appearance theory. As we get to know somebody, they become more attractive. This is a common error that we all need to know about, the fundamental attribution error. Essentially what the fundamental attribution error says is this: when we ourselves make mistakes, it's because of something external. And when somebody else makes a mistake, it's because of something internal. All right, so as an example, if I'm driving down the road and I accidentally cut somebody off, I think of it being external. Well, the reason why I cut them off was I was just really distracted thinking about my test, thinking about the speech that's coming up, thinking about how I'm going to pay my bills, and I'm really, really sorry about that. I shouldn't have done that. But if somebody else cuts us off, we think, oh, what a jerk, how rude. They just think they're the only person in the whole world, etc. So if somebody else makes a mistake, it's because there's some kind of character flaw, something internally deficient in them. If we make mistakes, it's because of something external that's preventing us from being all we could be. Fundamental attribution error. We want you to be aware of this for two reasons. One, we want you to do a little more accurate self-analysis. Perhaps the reason why you cut somebody off is because you do think you're the center of the world and there's room for improvement there. But also when somebody else cuts you off, think for a moment that maybe they're just having a bad day. There's other things that are going on to explain it. Right? So be more intentional and thoughtful, mindful, not mindless, about the way that you perceive things. So ways that you can improve your perceptions. Well, one is to be mindful, to be more conscious of things. Mindlessness is when you have a low state of awareness. Mindfulness is when you have a heightened state of awareness in a situation. Most of you are incredibly mindful when you come into class for the very first day. Because it's a new situation, new stimuli, those kinds of things. And you look around and you think, who am I going to sit next to that I'll be comfortable with? So like for me, when I would go into class, I'd look around and say, okay, where's the nerds? And then go sit down and say, hey, have you seen the new Lord of the Rings thing? All right, so you look for people who are similar to you, people who you'll be comfortable with. Right? That's being mindful in a heightened state of awareness. And even in transactions, say if you've been married for 20-something years, been dating somebody for a long time, just think about being mindful and not being on automatic pilot in your transactions. Be skeptical. Be aware of the fact that you could be wrong. I don't know how many times I've heard those conversations with people. You said this. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. You've got to be mindful and be skeptical that perhaps the way that you perceive things is not the way they were really meant to be. Ben Franklin was older by the time that he was involved in the Constitution. And he actually gave a speech right before people were called forward to sign the Constitution. And in it he basically said this: I don't believe that this document is very good. I think it's got lots of errors in it, lots of problems with it. However, the years have taught me that I am not always right. And I'm skeptical about my own ability to determine the rightness and wrongness of things. And after further consideration, I think this may very well be the best document that we could come up with at this time. He was having a healthy level of skepticism in his own ability to evaluate the worth of something. And we want you to be skeptical of your own abilities and realize that you are fallible. You are able to make mistakes. And the way that you think things are not always the way that things are. Also, be aware of the fact that you and other people have multiple selves. We do not operate in a world where we were only one thing. People are incredibly complicated. All right, so for instance, with me, this is the way that I am when I'm teaching a class. This is the clothes that I wear, the uniform, etc. This is the way that I am. But as soon as I get home, first thing I usually do is slap on my Steelers gear. I would never come to class dressed in my Steelers gear unless there was actual lesson to be applied for that. Multiple selves. The way that I operate at home and with other people is not the way that I operate in class. And it's the same with you. Even as students, I'm sure that some of you engage in a lot more profanity out in the hallways or out at home or out at the bar on Saturday, whatever it may be, than you do in this classroom. Operating underneath the identity of multiple self. You have to appreciate that people are complicated. And consider other options. So it may be that you're typically viewing somebody as rude. But maybe the reason why you think they're rude is because they're not making eye contact with you. Think about it. Evaluate. Maybe the reason why they don't make eye contact with you is because they're from a culture that doesn't value eye contact. It's actually considered polite to look down. When I was in college, I had a best friend. His name was Yusuke. Great musician, and I was studying music at the time. And when I went out with him the very first time, we hung out, I don't remember what we did, went to Jamba Juice or something, had a conversation. He might have bought a video game, I'm not sure. But we spent the day together, and the whole time he didn't crack a smile. And when we left, I thought he had just had the most miserable time of his life. But before we left, he said this: I had a good time. That's all that he said. And although I hadn't got any kind of nonverbals from him, the whole time I took him at his word that he had a good time and we had a great friendship. So culturally, many Japanese males do not smile. It's considered a sign of weakness. So this makes sense after I got to know him a little bit better. You see in all his family photos, the women are smiling and the men never do. It's a cultural value. So consider that there are other options in your interpretations. A few years ago, my wife was getting ready, and one thing I was amazed as I get to know the other gender, it takes a long time for some of you to get ready. And over the course of our marriage, I was kind of shocked by this, and so I'd asked her many times, hurry it up a little, those kinds of things. Well, one day it was raining outside, and my wife was getting ready so that we could go someplace. And I said, "Are you almost ready?" Because we had had previous communication transactions where when I would say something like that, what I meant was, "Could you hurry it up a little bit?" She reacted and she says, "I'm trying the best I can." But really the reason why I had asked, "Are you almost ready?" is because I was thinking it's raining outside. If I go get the car and pull it up closer to the building, then she won't get wet when she comes out. I just want to know if she's almost ready so I can go get the car. I didn't mean it to pressure her. But past communication transactions impacted the way that she read me and the way that I conveyed that information. So consider that there might be other options. All right. For instance, in Japan, it is considered very, very polite to slurp your soup. In the United States, that might be something that's considered rude. Think about other options. Culture can impact the way that people see things. Also, with touch. In France, they touch first and then speak. This is one reason why a lot of cultures view the French as being very, very rude. In the United States, if I wanted to pass by you on a bus, I would first say, "Excuse me, can I pass through?" Then you would move, and then I would pass by, and perhaps as I'm passing by, I might touch you. In France, they would go like this: touch, begin to push you, and then say, "Excuse me." Excuse me. The fact that they've touched you before they have asked permission to pass by would be considered rude from people who are not from that culture. Consider that there are other options. Cultural myopia. There's stories of missionaries who go to certain countries, and when they go into the countries, they actually have men and women who sit on completely different sides of the church. And it can be embarrassing when you first go in and spouses sit together and they find out later they were supposed to sit apart. All right, so there's different values in different cultures. When I was in the Air Force, there were what we call TCNs, third country nationals, that were serving on the base. I was in Kuwait, and there was a bunch of Filipinos that were there, and it wasn't uncommon for certain cultures for the men to actually hold hands as they would walk to and from work. In the United States, this is not something that you normally see. And if you do see it, unless it's a father with a child, it tends to be if two men are holding hands, you would immediately make assumptions about their sexuality. But that's culturally myopic, that there could be alternate explanations. All right, stereotypes also impact the way that we perceive things. The big thing about stereotypes is they can be either positive or negative. It's possible for them to even be neutral. So that in the United States, for instance, there's a lot of people who view an American soldier in such a way. If you see an American soldier in uniform, a lot of people have very positive impacts of them sort of as heroes. You stereotype them as heroic just because of the uniform. In the past, right in the Vietnam War era, after it ended, it would be the exact opposite, where you would see somebody in uniform and many people would actually shout insults at them, call them baby killers and those kinds of things. Right? So a stereotype. There are multiple different types of people who serve in the military. Some are very heroic and some are not. But we stereotype people in a certain way. In our particular community, if I did have a class in here right now, I'm sure that there are people who are members of the LDS Church, Latter-day Saints Church, who have had to deal with stereotypes. So just think about being more flexible in your perceptions. Prejudice, on the other hand, cannot be a positive or a neutral thing. It's a consistent and persistent and deep-seated ill will towards negative groups. Stereotypes can be neutral, positive, or negative. Prejudices, by the definition, are always negative. So it's where you're actually negatively inclined towards somebody just because they seem to fit in a particular group. That's prejudice, part of our perceptions. All right, with regards to our self-concept, there's something that's known as social comparison theory. And this is something that we do, for instance, when we walk into class and we decide who we're going to sit next to. You're looking for people who are like you, and you tend to view people who are like you more positively. For those people who watch reality television, things like American Idol, Biggest Loser, a lot of times if you'll do some evaluation, you'll see that you're choosing to like the person who you think is most like you, where there's some kind of similarity. All right, so up on American Idol, there's one candidate who you were young and you lost your mom, and they tell the story on American Idol, when I was 8 years old, my mom died. You immediately, because they're like you, may feel some kind of affinity or connection to them. This is social comparison theory. Also, self-esteem has an impact on the way that we perceive things. All right, so for instance, in my class, often I'll give a little bit of feedback after speeches are over, and I might say, "You're doing great." And a person with high self-esteem will typically receive that, "You're doing great," as if I really mean it. But a person who has low self-esteem tends to focus on the negative parts of things. So if I say, "You're doing great," and then I also offer some criticisms on what you can improve on eye contact. Because they have that lower self-esteem, they'll focus in only on the, "Oh, my eye contact sucks. My teacher can't stand me." Right? But people with high self-esteem tend to focus in on the positive. So be aware of that. If you're a person with high self-esteem, this can be a very good thing. It can help to drive you forward in a positive way. If you're a person with low self-esteem, evaluate the way that you receive criticisms and input from other people. Your low self-esteem often causes you to only focus in on the negative. And there's a concept known as self-fulfilling prophecy. And this concept can also, once again, be positive or negative. So for instance, if there's an athlete who's got to go out and hit a free throw, and they just think, "I'm the best basketball player that's on this whole team. This is going to be no problem for me." They step to the line, shoot, swish. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that I'm good, therefore I behave as if I'm good. A self-fulfilling prophecy. Other folks might have that negative self-fulfilling prophecy. "Oh, I'm a terrible speaker. I'm going to totally blow this." And then they come up here and they totally blow it. For instance, one time I went out with my sister and she was actually applying for jobs in like a strip mall. And she started at one end and I was actually in doing a transaction in another business here. She worked her way all the way down and she came in to get an application while I was in this other business. So I saw her go up to the counter and she asked like this, Are you doing any hiring? She was actually shaking her head no as she asked the question. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You think, no, they're not going to hire me. Therefore, you actually subliminally or subconsciously send out a message of no, and it makes it easier for the person behind the counter to say no. For those of you who are in any kind of sales position, this can have a counter effect. I used to be able to clean carpets while I was paying my way through school. And one thing that I would do is I would simply ask people, would you like to buy any of the extra cleaning supplies? And just simply shake my head yes as I asked the question. And we found that my sales were double and triple what other people's were. Once we suggested this tip to other people, sales went about 2 or 3 times higher just from simply shaking your head yes. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Self-denigration. This is very, very common. It's something that I want you to get away from. Talking bad about yourself. This is a stupid question, but most of the time when somebody prefaces a sentence with this is a stupid question, almost always it is not a stupid question. Yes, I believe that there are stupid questions. All right, I know in high school you're told there's no such thing as a stupid question. There probably are things as stupid questions. They're rare. There's no need to preface your sentences with that. All right, so get away from self-denigration. Think more highly about yourself. Self-presentation. This is just something that you want to understand, that the way that you dress and the way that you look, it actually sends a message. And this is pretty obvious, particularly I think we all know this with regards to job interviews and things like that. Self-presentation is incredibly important. All right, so self-monitoring. They've all probably had that friend who just doesn't seem, everything that they think internally just comes right out externally too. They have no internal voice, it's all that external voice. We need to be better at self-monitoring. Just being aware of the situation that we're in, who we're talking to, what degree of disclosure is appropriate, those kinds of things. Self-monitor. All right, so for instance, it would be completely inappropriate if somebody were in a speed dating situation where you have 2 or 3 minutes with somebody and then the bell rings or whatever and you go to the next person. You're just meeting a lot of people very, very quickly and on a very superficial way. So do you like in the course of this, I'm 28 years old, I live right in Nampa, I work for the sugar beet factory, I've got herpes, and I like to go on long walks on the beach. All right, that level of self-disclosure of I've got herpes would be completely inappropriate at that point in time. Have some self-monitoring. Be aware that, yes, this is probably something you're going to need to tell your interested partner at some point in time, but it's not appropriate in an initial meeting. Have a good self-monitoring. Be aware of that. Also, self-disclosure. It tends to be that when we disclose something, people will reciprocate with a similar topic and a similar level of disclosure. So just try this sometime with your friends. Go up to them, have a conversation or family, and just, I've been really thinking about going back to school. And often they'll respond to that, be like, oh, well, why are you thinking of these things? But sometimes they'll also, I've been thinking about doing this too. Right? I'm not really sure that I like Obama as a president. And then you'll get some kind of feedback from them about Obama as a president. People tend to have some kind of reciprocation. Right? And this is our perception exercise lecture.